Okay, so you should all see a screen that says trade and tariffs in front of you. I think you do. So let's go forward. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some recent U.S. trade policy actions and some of the controversies or discussions that have been out there. The first bullet point here, I want to highlight that there has been, without question, increasing concern and worries about globalization generally and international trade in specific. More and more, we're hearing in the public discussion that openness to trade and globalization has not really been working for us in the United States. That lots of promises were made that globalization and international trade were good, and yet there's lots of indicators out there that suggest that maybe it hasn't been good for all people. And so there is this growing backlash against globalization, against international trade. And this is not new with the Trump administration. This goes back 20 years, even 30 years or so, where people have become increasingly worried that globalization is really designed to help the wealthy get wealthier, and it's pushing poorer people down further and further. That's sort of a general impression that many people have. And there is an organization or an agreement that countries have made with each other, something called the World Trade Organization. That World Trade Organization is under fire currently, and people are concerned that its promotion of a freer trade is actually not in most people's interests, and that it's actually causing detriments to the economy rather than benefits. An issue we're going to explore today. Okay, now economists, second bullet point here, and many others tend to claim that free trade with other countries is largely beneficial for the country itself. And we're going to examine that particular claim, and we're going to talk about where that claim comes from and whether we should or could believe that particular claim or not. Okay, others in the economy or in the public discussion, and this would be especially labor unions themselves and firms in the United States that compete with imported goods, especially from countries like China, where trade has grown enormously over the past 20 years or so. Certain groups are claiming that the country is actually harmed because of international trade, and especially the interests that they represent, labor unions in the US and firms that are competing with imported goods. Firms in the clothing industry, for example, or in the furniture industry, or steel, or automobiles. All of these industries have argued from time to time that the trade is not working for them. And that has led to this kind of backlash against globalization and trade. Since China entered the World Trade Organization, this club or this agreement that countries have made goes back to the 1940s. This organization is designed to try to help countries promote trade liberalization or globalization more generally. And China entered this WTO organization back in 2001. And China's growth has been phenomenal for the last 30 years or so, topping upwards of 10% per year for many years going back in the last 30 years. That's only started to come down in the last 5 or 6 years or so. But China has grown tremendously. They've increased the amount that they trade with the world tremendously. And as a result, it has had some very big adjustment effects, not just in China, but in the US and in the EU and in many other countries around the world. So because of China's largeness, 1.3 billion people, and because of China's enormous growth, they have had an incredibly significant effect upon international trade patterns for the last 20 years or so. Okay, and more people are looking at that and saying that's been a detriment to the US, and we need to, the new terminology that people are using is that we need to decouple from China. We need to break our relationship with China, stop importing as much from them, and that's going to be what contributes to prosperity in the United States. Again, a claim we're going to consider in today's lecture. Now, I want to go back a step, and I want to highlight something that is sort of in the public domain in terms of the discussion that takes place out there generally. And I want to highlight the fact that most people tend to hear the following about trade and tend to believe these particular points. The first point that people tend to believe is that exports are good for the country. And you'll listen to politicians time and time again, go back to speeches over the last 20 or 30 years, and you're going to hear politicians saying, we need to export more. And they'll complain about countries abroad, saying they're not letting our products in. If only we could sell more to China, to India, to Europe, to Africa, if only we could export more, that would be a big benefit for our country. And, to go back a few years, I think it was in probably 2010 under the Obama administration, that they instituted what was called the National Export Initiative. Right? We don't need to go into the details of that, but its basic idea is let's promote exports. Why? Because exports are a good thing for the country. And that initiative was targeting trade, exports, and they said, let's double the exports we make over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. That was their initiative, their objective. Why? Again, popular impression, exports are a good thing for the country. They create jobs. That's the second thing you'll hear. And this is why we need to have more exports. At the same time, individuals are very inclined to believe that imports are bad for the economy, that imports cost jobs. The more we import from the rest of the world, the more we're suffering because of the lost jobs related to competition with foreign firms. All right, I'm going to challenge that particular perception today in our lecture, but that is the popular impression. And simply stated, exports good, imports bad. Most people believe that makes sense. That just makes sense. And that's an argument, or an argument about policy. Should we have freer trade? Should we have, not? Going back a long time, even to the days of Adam Smith, next bullet point, this was an idea that was popular at that time too. And it had a name associated with it, and it was called mercantilism. And mercantilism, in essence, is essentially the same idea. Export lots to the rest of the world, import as little as possible, and if possible, protect your country against imported products. So put up barriers to trade to prevent imports, but try to export as much as you can to the rest of the world. Right? That was viewed in the time of Adam Smith, known as mercantilism, and this was the idea of what it would take to make a country great. All right? Adam Smith, however, and others after him, was opposed to this whole idea. He didn't think mercantilism was the right approach and did not think it was good for the country. And he advocated, as did many British intellectuals at the time, for free trade. And this led to sort of the early stages of should we have freer trade or not? And a lot of the writings at the time of Adam Smith and thereafter, David Ricardo, the originator, if you will, of comparative advantage, they were in opposition to this whole idea of mercantilism. Okay, but mercantilism is a powerful force because it's believable. Most people will just kind of naturally, oh yeah, exports are good, imports are bad. I don't need to think about it anymore. Let's go on from there. Right now, there's another association that I want to raise your attention to. This idea that exports are good and imports are bad, it leads us to look at overall trade with other countries and we measure that trade with a measurement called the trade balance. Now, the trade balance can be in deficit or it can be in surplus. If a trade balance is in deficit, it means that the total amount of imports into a country exceed the total amount of exports. Okay, and because imports are high and exports are low in this measurement, well, most people look at that and say, well, that must be a bad thing for a country. Imports bad, exports good. Imports are exceeding exports and we have a deficit. That must be bad for the country. The United States, by the way, has had a trade deficit with the rest of the world for about the last 40 to 45 years in a row. Okay, and lots of folks have looked at the US and said, oh, well, look at how the US is weaker because of its trade deficit over the last 40 years. This too is not quite correct. And to learn more about why it's not correct, you would need to take an international economics course. Right. Now, we have had a large trade deficit with China as well during the last 10, 15, or even 20 years. And lots of folks have pointed to that trade deficit with China and said, this is why China is beating us up and why we're losing out because of this trade with China. Again, something that we're going to contest, or I'm going to at least talk about what the economic argument against that is, and we're going to learn about that today. Okay, now some actions recently by US. Trump became president 4 years ago. One of his policy positions at the time was this trade deficit with China is an embarrassment and we need to do something about it. We need to try to eliminate this trade deficit with China, and we need to get them to change their actions so that we can balance trade between our countries. Okay, and one way to promote that idea was to respond and implement tariffs on imports from China. Now Trump, when he was running for president the first time, said he wanted to raise tariffs against China to 45%, which is a really, really high tax. When he became president, he quickly discovered that the president doesn't actually have the power to just command that and do that. And you have to go through some complicated procedures legally in order to find a basis for raising tariffs against a particular country like China. We have certain commitments and promises we've made as members of the WTO, for example, and we can't just throw those away necessarily. Okay, well, changes were made, investigations were made under current US law, and in the end, in a couple of years after Trump was president, he was able to increase tariffs against China up to 25%, okay, on about $300 billion worth of imports from China. Okay, China reacted to that by placing up to 25% tariffs on US goods flowing into China. So a trade war ensued between the US and China, of which we are currently sort of in the midst of. Now, in January of this year, China and the US reached an agreement where China agreed to increase the amount that they're going to buy of goods from the United States, presumably to try to promote US exports. And this idea, again, exports are good. Tariffs are remaining in place right now, so that means we're choking off the imports from China. And again, US trade policy action is really motivated by this perception. Exports are good, we need to get more of them. Imports are bad, we need to choke them off with tariffs. This is pretty much Trump's philosophy on trade, which we're currently implementing today and working through the effects of that. Okay, now, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about the economic effects when a country opens up to trade. And two things can happen when a country opens up to trade. So first of all, our base scenario is going to be a country not trading at all. Okay, and then we're going to open up that country to trade and imagine two different scenarios. The first scenario is what happens if they begin to export a product or opening up to trade. We're going to ask the following questions. What happens to prices, domestic production and consumption? What happens to consumer and producer surplus? And what happens to market wealth? Question mark there. So we're going to answer those particular questions, all in the context of a perfectly competitive market economy operating within the country. Okay, then we're going to do the same exercise again. We're going to do it with imports of a product. Okay, see what happens. You open up to trade, you start to import a product. What are the effects? What happens to prices, production, surplus, welfare? Okay, and then we're going to ask, well, what if you're already importing a particular product? What if you put a tariff, which is a tax on imported goods? What if you put a tariff in place? What happens then? Okay, again, in the context of a perfectly competitive market, we're going to analyze the impacts of these different scenarios. So let's do it. First, an additional assumption I want to highlight. When we talk about trade with the rest of the world, trade economists will often distinguish between what are called small countries and what are large countries. So we're going to do our analysis in the context of a small country assumption, and that's defined as a country whose trade with the rest of the world is too small to have an impact upon the prices that prevail there. So that would be like saying, okay, well, we're importing a product or exporting a product, let's say, to the world. But the amount that we export is just a really tiny fraction of the world market. That would be a small country. And as a result, whether we double our production or stop production completely and export less to the rest of the world, it's too small of a change to have any impact upon the market price. So as mentioned in this next bullet, it's kind of like, exactly like the small firm assumption in perfect competition. In perfect competition, remember, firms are assumed to be too small to affect the market price. They then take the prices given and maximize their profitability subject to that. Okay, and we're going to imagine the same thing about a country now when we analyze the effects of trade. Now, the US is not really a small country in most respects and in most markets. The US is really a large country because if we change our trade pattern significantly with the rest of the world is going to notice it. The U.S. is the largest country in the world economy. It's the largest trading partner of many countries in the world. And as a result, if the U.S. changes its trade policies, it is likely to have an effect upon prices in the rest of the world. Okay, but we're not going to do that analysis here. You have to wait until you take an international trade or the Survey of International Economics course sometime later. And then this issue will be addressed. Okay, so in that context, remember, this is always true in a principles class. What we're doing is sort of the pass analysis of different types of issues. And in almost all cases, the issues are a lot more complicated than we have time to cover here. And there are alternative scenarios and situations always, caveats we have to be aware of. Economists have thought about all those things, and they're in lots of more advanced courses, then you can learn more about those things. Okay, so we're assuming small countries. We're going to go forward with that. Now, let's start by talking about exports, effects of exported products. Suppose we have a small country, first bullet point here, with a perfectly competitive market, and let's assume it's initially in autarky. Okay, what does that mean? Autarky means no trade with other countries. Very simple. It's you're isolating yourself. You're just not trading in that particular product. Closest example we have to that is probably North Korea. They don't trade very much with the rest of the world. They do trade some. They trade with China. They trade with Russia somewhat, perhaps a few other countries in the area as well. But North Korea is pretty much an autarkic country. They're also, notably, a very poor country in comparison. And no doubt, part of the reason North Korea is as poor as they are is because they're not open to the rest of the world. All right, now, when we have a market for a particular product, the autarky price and quantity is going to be the supply and demand intersection. And that's what you've now learned to be the equilibrium in an economy. Now, when we talk about international trade, that equilibrium of intersecting supply and demand is only going to be valid if the country is not open to international trade. When they open to trade, they might face a price that's different than their autarky price, right? And then that's going to be the prevailing price that's going to inform the decisions of the firms within that particular country. So to talk about an exporting firm, next bullet point, we're going to imagine that the world price that they face is higher than the country's autarky price. And we're going to see in a second, if that's true, then the country will automatically start exporting the product to the rest of the world. Now, one other simplifying assumption we're going to make here, just to keep the story as simple as possible, is to assume that transportation costs are zero. In other words, you don't have to pay anything more to move your product from one market to another. In reality, that doesn't happen. Of course, you have to pay something. It's costly to move products and to get them into other markets. But we're just going to ignore because all the calculations just become more complicated when we do that, and it doesn't change the fundamental result that we're going to demonstrate here. Okay, it just makes it more complicated to resolve and to get. So simplifying assumption there. All right, let's take a look at a diagram. On the right-hand side, we have a supply and demand curve for a particular product. Again, we don't have to put a name of the product here, but I will, just to remind you that this is not the market for everything in the country. It's just one particular product market, like coffee or butter or soybeans or whatever you want. All right, now, the autarky price is this price right here where supply and demand are intersecting. That's what price would prevail in this country if it were closed to international trade and just restricted. So let's imagine we're just restricting trade. You just can't trade with the rest of the world, kind of like in North Korea. Price would be P aught, quantity supplied and demanded internally would be Q aught. But now, suddenly the policy changes. The government says, okay, you can trade freely with whomever you want in the rest of the world. This country, little country, goes out and sees that the price of coffee in the rest of the world is much higher than it is at home. Right? What would happen? How would firms and consumers respond to a higher price in the world? And also, it doesn't cost you anything to participate in those foreign markets. What's going to happen initially is the following. Second bullet point here. Exporters are going to drive trade in this particular case. So firms, we imagine, are interested in maximizing their profits, trying to get more money. firms in this market are going to notice, hey, the price abroad is PW, which is higher than the price I'm getting at home right now. So I can make more money as a firm if I could sell my coffee abroad rather than selling it domestically at home. And that's going to inspire me to start exporting my product abroad to take advantage of that higher world price. Remember, once I do that and start exporting abroad, this country is too small of a player in the world to affect that world price, so the world price stays fixed at PW nonetheless. Okay, but the next step here is critical. As this country moves its product abroad and begins to export there, selling it abroad rather than selling it at home, then there's less available to sell at home. So the internal market is affected by the loss of supply that takes place due to exports. And as a result of the lower supply, just think supply and demand mechanics in your head. If there's a lower supply, like the supply curve were shifting left, it's not. But if it were shifting left, that would cause the price to rise. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. The domestic price is going to get bid up because of the lack of supply domestically as your firms start to export more abroad. And that means the price domestically has to converge to the world price. And that's what's going to happen, okay, a perfectly competitive market setting. Right? Now, as the price goes up to PW, that's going to enable the firms to expand their production. They're going to increase their supply from Q-aught to SFT, the free trade supply, as a result of the higher price that now prevails for the producers. But at the same time, the higher price also prevails internally in the local market because of the lack of supply domestically. That higher price domestically is going to choke off consumer demand. Consumers won't buy as much because of the higher price that prevails now internally. Okay, so demand falls to DFT, supply rises to SFT, and the difference between the two now, supply at the price PW is out here at SFT, demand is only at DFT. Well, what happens to this difference? The extra supply that's being undertaken? Well, that's what's being exported to the world market and sold abroad. Okay, so now we have a picture here of a new world price, higher than the autarky price, inspiring exports in this particular market abroad. And now the equilibrium, by the way, is PW and SFT and DFT. Notice equilibrium now, because of the assumptions we're making, is not at the intersection of supply and demand anymore. That's a different equilibrium under a different set of assumptions or circumstances. Okay, change the assumptions, it changes the outcome in the model. That's what we're doing in this exercise. Next, welfare effects. Let's find out, are exports good for the country? Is the statement about exports being good indeed true in this particular model? To do that, we can analyze the welfare effects. What happens to consumer surplus, what happens to producer surplus, and then what happens to national welfare. Okay, first of all, go back to the diagram and remember that in autarky, consumer surplus is given by this triangle that I'm highlighting here. All right? When the price goes up to PW, consumers cut back their demand, the price goes up, and the new consumer surplus is now given by this area. So what is the change? Consumers are clearly worse off because they have to pay higher prices for the product and they consume less than they did before. And as a result, consumer surplus is reduced by minus area B plus area C. That's the amount, the value in which consumer surplus is reduced as a result of exports to the rest of the world. Okay, so that's the first effect. Second effect, producers. Producers originally at the autarky price P-aught were getting this much surplus, F and G. But because the producers can now grab on to this higher world price and expand their production out to SFT, now producers are getting this much surplus, again, in the short run, because we've got an upward sloping supply curve. What is the effect on producer surplus? Well, it's going to turn out to be an area plus area B plus area C plus area D plus area E. So producers are going to increase their profitability by that area, B, C, D, E. Now, that's all that's going on in this market. So we can underline it and say, what is the change in the national welfare here? I should say delta, we've been using this term, MW, or market welfare. I get confused sometimes because in trade, I would always talk about this as the nation's welfare, which it is. But here, let's use our same terminology. So market welfare, how it's affected by exporting the product. To get that, we're going to add up the effects, and we'll notice that the B and minus B and plus B cancel out, minus C and plus C cancel out, and we're going to be left with a change in national welfare that's plus D plus E. These are efficiency benefits, efficiency gains as a result of trade. So trade is actually improving the overall market efficiency in this particular market. Okay, now what do we conclude? First of all, let's note that trade generates a redistribution of welfare between different groups in this market. The exporting firms benefit clearly. They get higher profitability, they expand their production, and by the way, as a result of this increase in supply, there are now more jobs in this industry. Because to expand production, you're going to need more resources. One of those resources is likely to be labor, and you're going to hire more workers as a result of an expansion of production. So exports are going to create more exports are going to create more jobs in those particular industries. That's good for the firms. Consumers, however, and this is an effect that is almost never discussed or pointed out, is that consumers of this exported product at home are actually losing out. And that's because, again, the product is now being sold more internationally. There's less available at home, and that's what's going to cause the price to go up at home. So prices are rising, consumers are a little bit worse off, but not as much as the profit benefits that are accruing to the firms. So the benefits of firms exceed the losses to consumers, and we end up with an increase in market or national welfare. All right, so is the country better off as a result of exports? Answer is, from this example, yes. Is everybody better off because of exports? Answer is no. Consumers of this particular product are going to be made worse off, while producers of this product gain even more. So net effect, efficiency effects, still positive. Economists would generally say exports indeed are a good thing for the country. Now, I want to highlight that statement really carefully because I will say this over and over again as we go through our analysis. Whenever I say economists say overall it's good, it doesn't mean that everybody benefits. It means the benefits exceed the losses. So to the extent that there is any redistribution, as there always will be when there's a change in policy, improvement in the market welfare, or the country's welfare, will always be determined in economic sense by whether the net positive effects exceed the negative effects. That's what's going on here. Okay, so that's the effects of exports. So exports are indeed good for a country. Conclusion, market welfare, MW or NW, increases. And by that we say economic efficiency is improving. We're getting more output. In the market overall, we're just improving the overall economic outcome in the market by exporting. Exporting firms expand output and create more jobs. And that's the point that I just made. But exports are not good for everybody. So that's just a summary of the effects that I just walked ourselves through. Now let's see about the other case, imports. Remember, the general impression I suggested to you is that imports are bad for the country. Let's find out if that indeed is true. For a country to import a product, here's what's going to have to happen. The autarky price, again, given by the intersection of domestic supply and demand, again, for a particular product, maybe coffee, has got to be higher. The autarky price has got to be higher than the world price. So if a country opens up to trade, example we're doing here, and they find that the world price for a particular product is lower than the autarky price, then here's what's going to happen. Consumers, next bullet point, are going to drive trade. It's sort of like you open up your country, you're in North Korea, and suddenly you've opened up to the world market, and now consumers in North Korea can tap into Amazon. And Amazon's got all these products, and it's a lot cheaper than at home. So consumers are now not going to buy domestically. They're going to go online, buy all these products from abroad, and assuming that Amazon offers free shipping to North Korea, strong assumption perhaps, but let's assume it, then you're going to be able to import these products at a much lower price. Now, let's think about that. If consumers shift their demand from the domestic market and buy imported goods instead, then there's going to be less demand for the imported products. And as a result of that lower demand for domestic products, the price has got to go down. Just think about a demand shift for a second. How would that affect the market price? If the internal demand for the products is lower because of the desire to buy foreign goods, then the price has got to come down domestically. And that's exactly what's going to happen. When you open up to trade with the rest of the world and find that the price abroad is lower, for a small country, you can't affect that price. You take that price as a given, and that becomes your own domestic price at home. So both producers and consumers at home are now going to face this world price of PW once you open up to trade in this particular circumstance. Now, because the price is lower, that's going to inspire the following adjustments. As we said, the lower price is going to inspire increased demand for products. So not only will consumers shift their purchases abroad, they'll also buy more stuff in total. So they're going to demand more because prices are lower for this particular product. Domestic producers, however, are going to be facing a lower domestic price for their good. And as a result, they're going to have to cut back their production, Q-ought to SFT. So as a result of that, there's going to be a drop in production, and that drop in production is going to mean fewer jobs in the industry. So workers indeed in this model are going to lose their jobs in the import competing industry, because of the lower price caused by opening up to international trade. Right? So this is in line with what we see and what people worry about with imports, right? So in our model, we are recognizing that indeed people will lose their jobs in this particular industry when we open up to trade. All right, now we got extra demand abroad, less demand at home, domestic price falls, demand rises, supply falls, and imports occur. The difference between DFT now and SFT is the amount of imports that are being brought into the country from abroad. All right, and notice the lower price, if you keep lowering the price, the larger will be the total amount of imports. Imports will rise more and more the lower the price is in international markets. And supply will be choked off more and more jobs will be lost the lower is the price in the international market. All right, now, a lot of folks think, okay, well, we're losing all these jobs. We should do anything we can to save those jobs. People are like, imports are bad, we got to save these jobs. What we can do in economics is we can evaluate the sizes of the benefits and losses and compare them to each other to see whether the losses to the firms, how they compare to the benefits that we can clearly see are going to accrue to the consumers. So let's do that. What happens when you open up to trade and you begin to import the product? Well, first of all, consumer surplus originally is given by the area A here. Consumer surplus at a lower price now is going to be given by this larger triangular area. The effect is the change is going to be an additional consumer surplus area of plus B, plus C, plus D. So consumers are going to benefit by that amount. How much will producers lose as a result of trade? Well, they're going to lose, of course, because they're cutting their supply down to SFT. And as a result, instead of getting area BE as producer surplus, now they're just going to be able to get area E. So producers are indeed going to lose profitability. Workers are going to lose their jobs. But their measurement of the welfare accruing in the industry is just the loss of B, which, when we add it up with the changes above, the B's are going to cancel out, and we're left with a national or market welfare effect plus C plus D. More efficiency gains. There are gains from trade on the import side, in other words, as well. So again, we get a redistribution, this time in the other direction. Consumers benefit, producers lose at home. But national welfare or market welfare has got to go up. Because you can see here, the benefits that accrue to consumers have to be bigger than producers because the demand curve is farther out to the right than the supply curve is whenever you're an importing country. So it's got to work out in this small country case. The net benefits from imports have got to be positive. Now, there is one thing that I have to highlight, I want to mention here. So let me summarize the effects of imports, and then I'm going to make the point I want to make. So imports are also good for a country. So the economic conclusion is that exports indeed are good for the country, but so are imports. Okay, suppose that we import even more than we did before. So imports are growing not to the level that we see here, but let's say that the world price is even lower down here. We're importing even more than we would have under the price PW. We get PW2 instead. Well, in this case, C is going to expand to this area, D is going to expand to this area, and the country's going to gain even more. So the more you import, the better off the country is overall as a result of those imports, which is kind of an interesting and provocative result. I mean, this is saying imports are good for the country, not bad. So that's what economists conclude. Exports are good, yes, but imports are also good. Now, importing firms do reduce output and lay off workers. But I want to highlight something. The lower output requires fewer imports, such as workers. Workers move to other industries. Oh, okay. And this is also kind of the prime motivating factor for why people are complaining about trade with China today. I want to highlight this particular result, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it as we go along. Now, imports from China over the last, between like 2000 and 2012, when the study was done, are assumed to have caused, or I should say shown to have caused, about 2.4 million job losses because we were importing goods from China rather than producing them at home ourselves. Okay, and that's become known as the so-called China shock. So the China shock has become a well-documented phenomenon. People have measured carefully 2.4 million job losses, all as a result of the imports that are coming directly from China. All right, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, in our model at least, the model is saying that as we import more and more, we're getting more net benefits for the economy overall. That the benefits exceed the losses, so the more we import, actually the better off people are in the country rather than the worse off. But what about the workers losing their jobs? What happens to them? That's what I want to talk about next. And I'm going to bring up a well-known economist and a term that's associated with him and give you a little bit of history here along the way. So there's an economist by the name of Josef Schumpeter, lived between 1883 and 1950. And he is very well known for the idea of creative destruction. He talked about economic markets, and said, in essence, that the perfect competition models that we were using were missing some very important elements. And most importantly, it was missing the idea of dynamics, that things change over time. And what he was arguing is that in a dynamic economy, there's going to be situations and times where conditions inspire greater supply and jobs are going to be created. So we have an example today of opening up and becoming an exporter in the rest of the world. When countries do that and begin to export more, it's going to create jobs in those particular industries. Okay, jobs are created, new firms are created, perhaps new factories are built up and grow. Okay, and that's the construction part, new jobs. But sometimes conditions actually cause the opposite. They inspire lower supply and jobs are lost, and that's what we're seeing in this example of imports. A country opens up and imports a product. In that case, the jobs are lost. But what happens to the workers who lose their jobs? Well, they don't stay unemployed forever. They might stay unemployed for a period of time, and we ought to take into account the losses incurred by that unemployment. But most workers who lose their jobs will look for a job somewhere else. And maybe in a month, maybe in 3 months, maybe in 6 months, in worse circumstance, maybe in a year, those workers will find jobs in other industries. So when you lose a job, it's not the end of the world. It's just the end of your time in that company, and it's time to move on to other industries. Now, while some industries are expanding, other industries, like the exporting industries, when you're opening up to trade, those industries are expanding. So you've got an adjustment that takes place within the economy, what we call churning in the economy, where some jobs are created in some industries, while other jobs are lost in other industries, and that's sort of a natural working of an economy. You should expect that there's going to be job losses in some industries, job gains others, and that should be viewed as a normal process. That process by Schumpeter was called creative destruction because He was also focusing on the fact that a lot of new industries come about, new firms and new jobs, because of the innovation process. New firms come up with new ideas and enter the industry. Or think about what we did just last week or a week and a half ago or so with the long run effects of markets, and how whenever market adjustments happen where positive profits are inspired and caused in an industry, that induces entry of firms. Well, the entry of firms has to be associated with new jobs and new workers, and those workers are coming from somewhere else in the economy. They're giving up their jobs elsewhere so that they can open up a firm within a expanding market, like in an export industry, right? And so it's new ideas and new people moving into new markets. That's the creative part. And they're coming out of other markets, which is the destruction part. So the economy can be thought of as constantly going through this kind of creative destruction process, right? So with that said, we ought to be a little bit careful about just jumping to the conclusion that lost jobs in an industry or in a market like imports, that necessarily is a bad thing for the economy. Okay, now what I want to show you next is some evidence to talk about how big the churning effect is in the US economy, and whether this is a substantial effect or not much of an effect to worry about. Okay, here's some data, and here's a way in which we can use data from the world to actually give us some sense of whether this is an important issue or not, and how important something like the China shock happens to be. All right, this is data from Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. They have this great data set that you can actually plot lots of different economics data, compare it to each other, and so forth and so on. But enough on that. The blue line that's listed here, first of all, the graph is showing data that's starting back in 2006 or so here and going up to 2020 today. Okay, it's plotting two different lines here. The lines are, the blue line is referring to total separations. This is monthly labor data, and what a separation is an individual that leaves employment in a particular firm. Okay, now they might leave for several different reasons. They might be laid off, the firm might fire them. They might quit their job because they're moving to another job and they've taken up that other job. They might be retiring and leaving the labor force entirely. So separations can come about for a variety of different reasons. Okay, but the U.S. Labor Department keeps track and monitors every month. They report how many people are separated from their jobs, lose their jobs essentially for one of these different reasons. You add it all up and you get total separations in the economy during the month. Hires. Hires refer to new jobs that are being created. It's total private, and so we're ignoring government sector here. It'd be better if we had government in here, but we don't. Okay, so this is just private sector employment. The hires are new jobs that are being created. So this is firms hiring new people, maybe because they're replacing someone who retired or someone who quit, or it's expanding firms like firms who are exporting more to the rest of the world. So they will all hire more people, and we can monitor and keep track of the total amount of hires that take place every month. Okay, what happens? What do we see here? Every time the blue line, the red line, let's say, here, is above the blue line, it means that there are more hires than there are separations. More jobs are being created than are being lost. So look at this point in 2012. The red line is above the blue line, and that means more jobs are being created that month than are being destroyed. This is a good example of the churning in the labor market or the creative destruction process that is constantly taking place. Now you look, throughout 2000s, from 2010 onward, the red line is every time above the blue line, which means in all of those months, there's more and more and more jobs being added to the US economy. But let's look at the size of the churning. Come over here and look at the numbers that we're measuring on the left-hand side. This is in thousands of individual jobs. The number we're looking at here, this whole graph is stretched between about 5,000 and 4,000. That means this number is actually 5 million. Let me highlight what that means. Take a particular month, like this year, 2012. The number of Hires, the red line, is at a level of about 4.5 million new jobs that were created in that particular month. The blue line is just a little bit lower at about 4 million jobs. That's 4 million jobs lost during the month. So that means in a particular month, like 2012, or come later to like recent times here, 2018, the numbers are closer to 5 million jobs created and a little bit less than 5 million jobs lost, right? That's the churning that's taking place in the US economy every month. 5 million jobs created, 4.8 million jobs lost, net effect 200,000 more jobs. What gets reported is the number of net jobs that get added, and that's in the range of like 200,000, 500,000, or sometimes come back here to the last 2 months in 2020 because of the pandemic. Notice what happened because of the pandemic. We have this big spike up here in the early part of 2020, and that's caused by the COVID shutdown, the pandemic shutdown. Job losses, separations rose to like over 8 million job losses in a single month, while created jobs fell during that same period of time. The difference represents all of these people who are becoming unemployed as a result of the pandemic. Okay? But now, let's go back to that China shock and think about how significant it is. Now we've got something that tells us the magnitude of the churning in the US labor market. China trade was estimated to cause 2.4 million jobs over about a 12-year period. So that means if we break it down and say how many jobs are actually lost in the economy per month because of China trade, the answer is about this, 20,000. I figured this out on the side. All right, so 20,000 jobs are being lost per month because of trade with China. Now compare that to normal workings in the market. That's 20,000 out of 4,500 average separations that are taking place each month. So yes, it's adding more job losses to the economy, but it's not that huge of an effect. It's not much of a shock at all to the US economy to lose 20,000 jobs because of trade when 4.5 million jobs are being lost on a regular basis every month, month after month after month. Okay, so there's a good example of how we take data, kind of compare it to the things that are being said about it, and put it into a better perspective about whether this is worrisome or not very worrisome. Okay, let's go on. What we can conclude from just the effects of trade is the following. The mercantilist and popular view that exports are good and imports are bad for a country, well, it conflicts with standard results in perfectly competitive markets. If markets are not perfectly competitive, if there are other problems, we can tell different stories, and we're going to tell some of those stories a little bit later on. But as a first pass, the popular impression is not in line with what economic models are suggesting. Okay, the economic result instead should be something like the following. Exports are good, imports are good too. And in fact, the more we export and the more we import, the better off the country will be overall. So the more trade that comes about, not forced trade, but free trade, the more free trading decisions are made between individuals in different countries, the better off will be market welfare or overall economic efficiency. That's what the model suggests to us. So economics does not align with the popular impressions that are out there. Suggesting one conclusion I often come to is that nobody really listens to economists. And there's some truth to that, and we're going to emphasize that as we go along a little bit more. Now, there's one other thing I want to highlight. That is something that I'm going to refer to as the Walmart effect. Okay, the Walmart effect is the other side of the story. What happens with trade, especially with imports, is that it lowers prices, right? And lower prices mean that households, individuals can buy more stuff than they did before. That's going to be true in the specific markets where we're importing more. And if we import lots of different products from China or from wherever, prices are going to be lower because of that international trade. Now, prices will be a little bit higher for the goods we're exporting. But what if we took our models and put all of this into our models and figured out, well, how much better off are people in the economy because of the lower prices, like the lower price goods you get at Walmart? You know, at Walmart, you can go in and buy a toaster for $15. You can buy a microwave for $30 or $40. All of those products with price tags on, all of these products, many of them are produced abroad. And the price tags on those products are significantly lower because of the trade we're conducting with the rest of the world than they would be if we didn't trade with those countries. If we closed ourselves off, the prices of goods in Walmart are going to go up. If we decouple from China, the prices of goods in Walmart are going to go up. Who's going to get hurt because of that? Lower income households. Poorer people will be hurt more when trade diminishes or is cut back. Let me show you something. Now, this table requires a little bit of explanation, but it's based on a study by some economists who did some very sophisticated modeling to try to get at the following question. When a country opens up to trade, how much do people benefit in terms of their purchasing power of their income, what is called real income? Okay, how does their real income change because the country is trading compared to what happens if the country didn't trade? So this study is doing a simulation. It's basically saying, what do incomes look like because we're trading with the rest of the world? And it did it for a bunch of countries, the US, all the OECD countries. I've just got a few listed here. How would people's incomes look like if we simply closed down trade completely and went back to autarky? Or in other words, how much higher are people's incomes because of trade that's taking place with the rest of the world? Now, the study is important here because they didn't just do it in the aggregate across the entire country, which they did. They also broke it up by income percentiles. What this means, the 10th income percentile means the 10% poorest households within the individual country. And the 90th income percentile means the top 10% of people earning income in that particular economy, the richest households in the country. They were noting that people in the top incomes, they buy different goods than people in the lower incomes. If we were to ask who's benefiting from the lower prices in Walmart, it's going to be this group here. It's the 10th income percentile, the poorest households that are shopping at Walmart, not the richest households in the country, right? So let's look at the US first and just interpret these numbers. This is saying that in the aggregate, on average, across the entire country, all income levels, the US is actually 8% richer because of trade with the rest of the world. Now, again, this is not just trade with China. This is all trade, all countries, totally. Okay, so the US is making 8% more in real income. So that's like saying if you had an income of $10,000, you're making $10,800 really because of trade. You've got $800 of extra money in your pocket. But look at the 10th income percentile, the poorest households in a country. In the US, the 10th income percentile is making 69% more in income because of trade with the rest of the world. That means if you've got an income of $10,000, you're actually able to buy about $17,000 worth of goods because of trade. Or in other words, if your income is $17,000 today because we're trading, if we choke off that trade, your purchasing power is going to drop to more like $10,000. Okay, if you double the income to $20,000, then it's like instead of making $34,000 a year as a low-income individual or household, you're going to only be able to buy $20,000 worth of goods and services. That's a pretty sizable effect. And that means that if we choke off trade with countries like China and others, if we decouple, who's going to get hurt the most? The poorest people in the economy are going to suffer income losses because of that decline. There's some other countries. You can see that in some countries, like Lithuania and Hungary listed here, some people are going to be almost 100%. They're going to have their incomes cut in half if they were to stop trading with the rest of the world. Lower income households benefit the most from international trade with the rest of the world. And so actions that we take to try to diminish that trade is going to cut into those welfare benefits that are already accruing to them.